Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us today in this discussion, especially to our participants, to our panelists, to which I will come in a minute. Our discussion today will focus on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and its policy implications for Africa-EU relations on issues related to migration, mobility, and displacement. And we will have a particular focus on insights and perspectives from Africa, and for which we are lucky to have and honored to have our distinguished speakers with us today. Let me go alphabetically maybe. So first we will have Professor Aderanti Adepoju from the Human Resources Development Center based in Lagos, Nigeria, who is a leading migration specialist and who has extensively worked and published on migration in and from Africa, as well as on the links between migration and Africa's regional integration, for which, counting all the publications and the work he has done, we wouldn't have enough time. Then we have Professor Mehdi Lavlu, who is a professor of economics at the National Institute of Statistics and Applied Economics, as well as at the University of Mohammed V in Rabat. And Mehdi has also worked extensively and published extensively on issues related to immigration, and their links, these issues links with sustainable development, mainly in North Africa and sub-Saharan African countries. And lastly, we have Ms. Ottilia Anna Manganidze, who is the head of special projects at the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria. Ottilia's research interests, also another very leading expert on migration trends and policy, but she is also interested in international criminal justice and international human rights law, and specifically also focuses on the African Union. Let me just briefly explain to everybody where the idea of this webinar comes from and what we aim to do to discuss today. So this webinar is linked to a mini publication project we are actually conducting with our distinguished speakers today, as well as Sion, who couldn't be with us today, as part of the project that is almost going to finish, that we are running at the EI on the new European consensus on asylum and migration. And the idea for this project, of course, came a little bit imposed, let's say, by the COVID-19 pandemic and how it has produced effects on many dimensions of life in general, let's say. But regardless of the pandemic and before the pandemic has entered into our lives, we were already following closely the migration, mobility, and displacement issues in the Africa-EU partnership agenda, as actually 2020 was and has been a year not only important in terms of COVID and all its effects, but it was also supposed to be actually an eventful year, let's say, an important year for the next upcoming agenda for the Africa-EU partnership. We had at the very beginning of the year, not at the very beginning, around March, we had we saw EU publishing its comprehensive strategy with Africa, in which migration and mobility was included among the main priority issues. Then the EU, the African Union, European Union summit was supposed to take place also in 2020, where this new strategy or a reconfigured strategy would be discussed and negotiated, which had to be postponed to next year, but still going on. And at the same time, of course, in the broader context, we have the post-Cotonou negotiations, ongoing post-Cotonou negotiations, which are also expected to gain momentum. So all of this already made, as I said, 2020 an important year for what is going to come up in terms of the partnerships between the two sides, not only on migration and mobility, but also on this issue area. And then against this background, COVID-19 and the pandemic, and with all its effects on economy, on health, on directly migration and mobility and movement related issues, actually has entered our lives. And especially in terms of migration mobility, as I said, it has had and still has direct effects on human movement in general, and everywhere, not only in Africa and in Europe, but almost everywhere, due to the border closures, lockdowns, and restrictions to mobility in general that we have seen and still are experiencing to a certain extent. So in light of all this, with the publication project that the papers are going to come slowly in the coming months, and with this webinar, we aim to discuss how such multidimensional impact by the pandemic unfolded in Africa and in Europe and in the relational space between them, let's say, and what kind of impact we have seen in terms of migration, mobility, and displacement in Africa and between Africa and Europe. Of course, it is easy to foresee and guess or have a full account of what kind of impact this can have concretely. But already on the basis of what we have been observing so far, we would like to discuss with our speakers what kind of impact we can expect and what are the policy implications, what are the implications of all this for the upcoming agenda, let's say, of partnership between the two continents. And so I think I will stop here, and what we have in mind is that in the first part of the discussion we would like to focus more on the impact and trying to understand this, and an important part of this webinar and the project is that the real aim here is to get locally grounded, to be able to have the opportunity and the luck to have the locally grounded perspectives and insights from Africa, and for us to make think what all this means and how the partnership can be improved in light of all these developments that we are seeing. So let me start with first Professor Adepoju, and given his particular expertise on West Africa and Nigeria, let me ask him, maybe already on the basis of the introduction that I have tried to do, the impacts to explain us what kind of multidimensional impact, let's say, we have had seen so far emerging from the COVID-19 pandemic and all its effects on health, on socioeconomic issues, on macroeconomic conditions, let's say, as well as on mobility and movement, human movement in general in the region, in Nigeria, in West Africa. Professor Adepoju, please, the floor is yours.
First and foremost, I want to thank Ashley for insisting that I'm engaged in this discussion. I need to put on board some preambles, which are necessary background to our discussion. The first, in terms of socio-demographic dynamics, Nigeria is the biggest country in West Africa. About 60% of the population of West Africa are Nigerians. Secondly, in terms of economic characteristics, most of West African economies depend on small-scale workers. Small scale, mostly in informal sector. About 60 to 70% of workers are in the informal sector. And that is very important in terms of looking at the impact of any crisis, maybe health, economic, political, on the population of the sub-region. Thirdly, the impact of coronavirus should be seen in the context of health conditions. Most countries depending more and more on traditional health care systems, and the population is extremely young. And that is a key aspect that we need to focus on discussion. So where are we today? Three measures are important. The first is the economic impact by sectors of border closure, tourism, on regional trade and commerce. Migrations in West Africa is intra. Most of the migration is not south-north, but south-south. That is within the sub-region, within Africa itself, and mostly within West Africa. And that is facilitated by the protocol on the free movement of persons to move freely within the sub-region in West Africa. The second is the health impact in terms of transmission, vulnerabilities, and containment. West Africa had a unique experience with regards to the Ebola epidemics in 2014. And the preparedness took advantage of the existing institution. Like in Nigeria, for instance, the first index case came from Liberia and quickly spread from there to other parts of the country in Nigeria. The frontline casualties also took advantage of the experiences and the infrastructure and the lessons learned from the containment of the Ebola crisis. There is a social impact in terms of repression, domestic violence. Families set apart. The border closure also meant the people living in borders were denied access to exchange of information. Let me also say that many countries in Africa have just the free trade agreement of persons, of tariffs, and intra-continental trade. But that has been hampered considerably by lockdowns, by border closures, and by the livelihood through unemployment. Few African countries, palliatives to bail out. Many of them were also having programs to ensure a speedy return of nationals that were denied residence in Europe. And some of the European countries were also considering measures for repatriation, return, and reintegration as a cardinal point in the partnership agreement between Europe and the African continent.
Professor Adepoju, sorry,
Yes.
I am really sorry, but I have to interrupt you. We are having quite a lot of difficulty in understanding, putting the pieces together, because we hear you in a very divided way, let's say. And so maybe we can suggest, and I completely understand because you have connectivity issues, and I'm sure our participants will also understand that Professor Adepoju is in a remote area, not in Lagos, and is having connectivity problems. Thank you so much. I managed to bring some things together, the three important measures in terms of economics, and especially South-South movement within Africa and within the region, West Africa, and the health impact and the experience gained from the Ebola pandemic. We can later on try to delve into these issues. And the last part was focusing on free trade and how the pandemic impacted the intra-continental and intra-regional free trade. So, Professor Lalu, now we turn to you. Basically, the question is pretty much the same as in this part. We are focusing on the impact of the pandemic on socioeconomic issues, on health issues, on migration, mobility in the region and between the region, Maghreb and Europe. So, in the case of the Maghreb or in Africa in general, it's also in general a general assessment is that the COVID pandemic has not generated problems from scratch, from zero, but it has somehow acted as a multiplier of existing challenges. And in terms of Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, the Maghreb, how do you see the impact of the pandemic and the multidimensional impact on socioeconomic realm, on macroeconomic realm, on the livelihoods, on employment, and on migration dynamics in general, as I said, within the region and between the region and Europe in this case. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Asli. Thank you for having associating me to set this project. And hello, everybody. I'm speaking from Rabat, Morocco, and I'm very sorry that we couldn't hear our colleague from Nigeria as good as we were wishing that. But now I will present some point of view and also some global consequences of the coronavirus on the African continent and within the African population, but also in the Maghreb. As everyone has noted that, in terms of direct consequences of the coronavirus on public health, so far, the African continent has suffered more or less than the rest of the world, and certainly less than the European and the Americans. But even if such situation happened, on the economical and social level, the consequences on African population was very and is still very, very, very important. Everyone knows that, for example, the number of cases in Africa was very low comparing to the American or to the European or even to ASEAN. But now what we also seen that the pandemic affected more intensively countries in the North Africa area, precisely Morocco, Algeria, and Egypt, and also South African Republic, but not the sub-Saharan countries. But even that happened like this. The fact is that the sub-Saharan region was and will be very, very affected by the coronavirus, not the coronavirus consequences as a health problem, but the consequences of the global economic and social crisis. On this probably three main levels. The first one is the fail of the internal income, and with all the estimation from the World Bank and from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, are telling us that the decrease of the internal income will be about from 5 to about 12–13% during 2020 for countries like Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, but also for many countries from sub-Saharan countries. And this will probably make more problematic the situation of the sub-Saharan countries, as already everyone knows already that about 20 countries among the poorest countries in the world are Africans, and the decrease in the income linked to the coronavirus will affect very highly the global economic situation of such countries. The second problem is linked to unemployment. As everyone knows, that in countries like Morocco and Tunisia, for example, the tourism is one of the most important part of the economic activities. But this part is also important in many sub-Saharan countries, with the internal as with the external tourism. For example, in Morocco, the tourism is responsible of about 10% of the internal income, and it's the same situation in Tunisia. And also we do have some international tourism in Senegal, in Cameroon, and other countries in sub-Saharan region. And this will conclude, has already conduced these countries to a loss of 100,000 jobs. And this one of the reason of the increase of the unemployment. Second effect is that Africa is exporting the main important product to the rest of the world, and also Africa, including Maghreb, or importing from the rest of the world all they are needing for their life. For example, medicine product, pharmaceutical product, alimentation, and so on and so on. And as the international trade almost stopped by March and last April, we did have a very decrease of the internal production, and also a real decrease of the reception of international currencies to help to the development of such countries. For example, in Morocco and Tunisia, the external balance of goods and services is today very unbalanced, more than it was before. And I guess that it's the same situation in the sub-Saharan countries. Another important thing to say here is that when many African doctors are acting in Europe or in America, for example, about 10,000 Moroccan doctors are today working in France, and some others are working in Spain, in Italy, and in Canada. We don't have enough doctors to protect the public health in our countries. And the data in my disposal show that in Europe and in the OECD countries, you do have about 36 doctors for 10,000 people. In Africa, we only have 2 doctors for 10,000 people, and it's a very dramatic situation. And another thing to say today, and that thing that it will have very important consequences when we see that the external debt, the service of the external debt is using about 15% of the public expenses in Africa. 15%, 15, yes, 15% of the internal expenses. That means that the public authorities, that the states and the state in all the sub-Saharan countries are not in a situation to affront sanitary problems, but also the school problems, but also the employment problems. And this has today, all these consequences are led today to have more migrants, and from North Africa, and we saw that from Libya, Tunisia, and mainly from Tunisia to Italy since the beginning of the coronavirus crisis. And we saw that also from Morocco to Mauritania, Senegal, to Canary Island, as the number of migrants reached about 30,000 people. That means it's the same number that the one was reached by 2006 when about more than 30,000 people left from the West African coast to the American island. So what we can say that the consequences of the coronavirus, even if the sanitary crisis didn't affect directly the Africans, the consequences affected very highly the sub-Saharan countries mainly, but also Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria. But with Algeria, there is some difference, as Algeria is mainly living on its oil production and exportation. And so it's affected directly our economies. And this affected also directly the situation of the job market, and directly also the movement of the population within the African countries, but also from the African countries to Europe by the channel of Tunisia, Italy, and the West African coast to north to Canary Island. Now I have just a remark, and we'll stop at that point. What I see is that the migration from our countries is not necessarily a negative migration. And you saw today, for example, as with the beginning of the vaccine in the United States of America, the responsible of the campaign of this vaccination is a Moroccan, Monsef Slawi, who is leading this great operation, Speed War. And we see also that in Germany, in Berlin, the leader of this company, BioNTech, is a Turkish man and Turkish woman. And we saw also that in the Moderna in the United States is also a migrant from Greece. And for AstraZeneca in England, is also a migrant. That means that every year, and certainly from the south part of the world countries, we are also losing very important skills and very high skilled people who could contribute to save our population from problematic like this sanitary crisis. I stop here and take you, Azli.
Thank you very much, Professor Lalu. I mean, you did a very concise, but at the same time very comprehensive review, and ending with a positive note, to which we will turn later on, I'm sure. And now I turn to Miss Ottilia Manganizze. And Ottilia, we have already started to look a little bit into the particular regions, but also already the discussion started to turn into broader continental dynamics, sub-Saharan Africa at least. What I would like to ask you is, yes, the impact of the pandemic, and in all these issues that we have covered, but also particularly in terms of movement within the continent, movement of not only people but also of goods, because this also quite very much linked to the agenda, the development agenda of the African continent, and the free trade agreement, continental free trade agreement, which is hopefully will be, and it's aimed to be linked to a broader, in the broader future, to a regional free mobility mechanism, let's say. So also considering all those issues and it's their links with migration too, I would like to ask you, yes, seen from a broader continental perspective, what do you think the impact of this pandemic and the ensuing measures coming from the pandemic and the global level effect, let's say, is on the continent, on migration, mobility and displacement issues, but also beyond and in the interlinked issues of development, of free trade, of free movement? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Asli, and thank you both to Professors Adepoju as well as Lalu for their introductory remarks, because they make my job a little bit easier. Having framed the context both in West as well as North Africa in terms of the direct health impact that COVID-19 has had, but more generally and perhaps more prominent for the continent, is the broader socioeconomic impact that has. That really helps in the framing of my intervention. I will try to be very brief so that we can go to the next segment, which is more constructive engagement beyond looking at the terrain. So importantly, and Professor Lalu already spoke to this, but he spoke to it from the countries outside of the continent that have benefited from migrants, whether African migrants or migrants elsewhere. Professor Adepoju spoke about how the majority of migration within West Africa, but also the majority of migration on the continent is actually within the continent, between neighboring countries or going further afield. That's an important point of departure, because when we speak about issues of brain drain, or when we speak about issues of the countries that can stand to benefit the most if we leverage migration, it would be the African countries themselves, provided that that is done correctly. But before we go into that discussion, looking at what I sort of call the spanner that was thrown into the works of Africa's development in the form of COVID-19, but perhaps also an important learning moment for the continent. So because Africa views migration primarily through a development lens, it means where the impact of a health crisis actually has a greater impact socioeconomically, it does mean that it affects what are the key targets for the African continent in the short term, in the medium term, as well as the long term. Professor Adepoju spoke about how in West Africa, the majority of people are young, but invariably also the majority of traders and the majority of those moving are young. This is not unique to the West African region. Across Southern Africa, East Africa, perhaps only the exception is North Africa, the majority of the population are below 26 years old. And so that leaves us with a median age of 19. And it means where a health crisis that has affected other countries, particularly in the north of the world, through deaths and other health-related matters, for Africa, that's not the case. Yes, people are dying on the African continent. Yes, people are affected. And because of the lack of sufficient public health care, there is still a health crisis. But at the same time, the economic impact and its knock-on effect on development, on trade, on access to resources and the ability to ensure stability and peace on the African continent becomes more stark where you have a population shut out essentially from the global economy by a crisis that is effectively a health crisis. So I'm going to wrap this initial intervention by calling on a few issues related to migration. Where we have policies which is evolving across the African continent, but more prominently across the Sahelian band, from West Africa through to the Lake Chad Basin, to the Horn of Africa, that encourage a securitized approach to migration, which aims to limit movement, effectively limiting trade and the ability of people to be able to access new markets and get jobs, but also discourages circular migration. This actually has a greater negative impact. Now, how does COVID-19 relate to this? Once people recognize that COVID-19 is primarily spread, whether through the droplets, but also really through the flows of people from regions that have high infections, even African countries began to close off their borders and limit movement. While this has helped to contain entry of the virus within African countries, it has also meant that one thing that was allowing people to be able to have greater socioeconomic activity is also hindered. The knock-on effect is that because people still need to move in order to be able to eke out their living, that more and more people are opting for illicit routes. And so we have seen in some areas an increase in smuggling, whether it's self-smuggling or being smuggled by other people. So here you have a good measure to control a health crisis, actually having a knock-on negative effect that encourages criminality. And that would need to be discussed as well. But importantly, it has affected the ability of Africans to migrate for labor. And therefore, it has created an additional block for a legal pathway for movement that did not exist before COVID, but rather that was expanded on. And so these are, I think, elements, Asli, if I can end here, that we ought to reflect then on how do we ensure, having spoken now from the African side, but how do we ensure that in the efforts to a better, more informed partnership between Africa and its immediate neighbor to the north, Europe, that these are all considered and that we have, which is what is currently lacking perhaps, a holistic take on a health crisis, but that has a strong socioeconomic impact, particularly for Africa and Africans.
Thank you very much, Ottilia, for, as always, being so much to the point and underlining the most important issues and the linkages that sometimes it's not so direct to see, but yes, from a health crisis to a setting which sort of encourages, let's say, and changes the dynamics of smuggling. It seems a long way, but it's actually quite a quick, direct impact, as we have been seeing. And yes, in this part, you have already, thanks for that, you have already done sort of the smooth transition to the looking into the future and looking into the measures that we, Europe and Africa together, can deploy, let's say, to face this situation, this altered context that we are seeing, but also to have a holistic approach that you said seems to be lacking so far. And which brings me actually to the maybe to do a little bit of a recap of the policy developments and initiatives, let's say, that we have seen this year, and sort of providing the background and the context for the negotiations and for the cooperation initiatives for the upcoming years between Africa and Europe. And there we see, on the one hand, we see the comprehensive strategy that the EU has published, which part of it is migration and mobility, but it is beyond that. And there is this really very much, at least on discourse or on paper, on the European side, there's very much an emphasis on having a comprehensive partnership, focusing on mutual benefits, focusing on sustainability of cooperation, which at the same time with the new pact on migration and asylum, which was also published in on the 23rd of September, again, we see this framing of comprehensive partnership and migration as an issue alongside many other issues, which actually touches upon on what Professor Lalou said and on what Professor Adepoju said in terms of closely linked issues regarding the development, regarding the socio-economic conditions, employment issues, demographic issues, etc. So at the same time, the pact, for example, the new pact, touches upon or frames a desire, an aspiration towards such a comprehensive partnership with many issue areas and linking them in a constructive and mutually reinforcing way, let's say. But also when it comes to the international partnerships part, the relations with third countries, we see alongside with creating economic opportunities, supporting the refugees and host countries outside the EU, we also see the more migration management part, which actually, Ottilia, you have very well described for the Sahelian Lake Chad Basin, of a sort of securitized approach that mainly is oriented to limit movement, let's say. There we have also very much focus on migration management, counter smuggling measures in the new pact on migration and asylum, as well as, of course, the politically challenging and sticky, let's say, issue of return and readmission between the two sides. And at the same time, in parallel, we have the post-Cotonou negotiations, and we have the African free trade, continental free trade agreement, and the developments going on there. And as all of you have underlined, the importance of intra-regional and intra-continental mobility of goods and people for labor also, and how the pandemic somehow impacted, but also negatively impacted such mobility, but also underlined the importance of such mobility of goods and people inside the continent. So in parallel to the migration agenda there, we also have this broader agenda. And actually, when we talk about a comprehensive partnership, of course, we are talking about all these different dimensions. And so I would like to turn to Professor Lalou maybe first, and ask you that in light of all these effects that we have talked about, and the effects are not really limited to the area of migration and mobility, but we are seeing the repercussions, let's say, from the broader socioeconomic dynamics also on the migration mobility issues, with a focus on, again, on North Africa, but in general also Sub-Saharan Africa, as you have already done. In terms of this upcoming partnership, I think one thing that Ottilia said could be a good point of departure for all of us and for both sides of the partnership, that the COVID-19 pandemic perhaps served as a learning experience for the continent. And perhaps this COVID-19 experience and all this reflection can also serve as a learning experience from past cooperation dynamics for the reconfiguration and deepening, let's say, of future cooperation dynamics. And there, of course, our focus is on migration and mobility, but as all the speakers have already underlined, these issues are very much intertwined with broader developmental issues, socioeconomic issues, external debt, as you underlined, Professor Lalou. So not only on migration and mobility, but in terms of a comprehensive partnership covering also other issues, what do you think? What do you think is the way forward? What do you think we could, or the EU, Africa-EU partnership should be focusing on and engaging in a rethinking, let's say, of the past experiences in the upcoming period? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ottilia, for completing what I said with our friend from Nigeria. I think that the pandemic gave us the opportunity to understand our real position, our real political situation, not only as African, but as African and Europeans. Europe is too weak politically, and today even on the industrial level, when it compared to China and to North America. And we saw how Europe was depending from the importation of all the product of pharmaceutical product and sanitation products, and all what was used at the beginning of in March, April, of health equipment from China, but from India also. And that was a very, very important lesson for the Europeans. Even for when you start to produce masks, even when you start to import some breed equipment. And this was the same situation in Africa. And this lesson means that Europe, as Africa, has to look to each one on a different manner. And according to me, the backfield and the background situation of Europe is Africa. Europe cannot cannot be cannot have sustainable development in the forthcoming years and the forthcoming decades without cooperating on a balanced basis with the African countries. That is an important lesson. Second important lesson is I told you at the beginning about the doctors from Maghreb, from Djibouti, from Senegal, from Cameroon, who are working in Europe. And I think that the country like France is depending today of about 27% of its sanitary system from African doctors and African nurses. And this is important, and for the next, probably in the next coming years, I don't have the feeling that the other doctors will leave Africa to go to Europe, because the situation here, their situation there is not, it's very difficult. And I think that our lesson here in Africa, in Morocco, for example, that we are in for important need of our proper doctors, and probably the public policy will change to keep more people, more high-skilled people, more doctors, more engineers here in Morocco, and I hope that will be also the same for the other African countries. My point of view, and it's my what can be seen as a solution for the future, that the African countries have to open their borders for more mobility of Africans. And we have to build more important regional economic cooperation. And my point of view for the Maghreb is we do have to open our borders and internal borders between our countries. And with this opening, this option, we will create more wealth, more employment, and more opportunity for more exchange with inside Africa, but also between Africa and Europe. And on the other side, I think that everybody knows that the African migration is not the most important in the world. And Europe, for example, is, I can say this word, is more affected and more concerned by migration from Asia, from Latin America than from Europe, from African countries. And African countries are already are receiving more migrants than they can support. We can say about the situation of Sudan, situation of Mali, of Burkina Faso, of the lake in Central Africa. Some countries are supporting more migrants than they can support, and it's not a problematic for Europe. I have the feeling, I'm sure about that. But even for that, Europe has to change its kind of relationship with Africa. Has to change, for example, the agriculture policy, have to change, for example, the fisheries policy, have to change also the approach, the political approach, even with countries like Gabon, like Central Africa Republic, like Mali, like Niger, even like Niger. And my point of view is we have to share more in a more balanced manner the wealth created by such countries, and to let a part of this wealth in the African economies. And I will stop here. I have only now two main important issues. The first one is the issue of education. The issue of education is fundamental. And we do have to do the African countries, African public authorities, and also the European countries and the international institutions to help Africa to build a more strong educational system. And the second part, the second thing is that we do have to build another system of health in Africa. We know that Africa is producing between two sides, producing very important number of doctors who are going to Europe, America, and other countries. But we do need also this doctor to stay here, but not only to keep the doctors here, but also the build basis of a new sanitary system which can help to alleviate all the pandemic we can see during the forthcoming years Ebola, HIV, coronavirus, and other virus. As we know that the climate change will produce many kind of this problematic for the forthcoming years, and this leads me to the problem of the climate change and for a new approach according to this situation regarding its global consequences on the African societies. We are not producing, we are not contributing to the climate change in Africa, but we are supporting the most important effect of this phenomenon on our population, and this have to be stopped.
Thank you very much, Professor Lalu. Yes, comprehensive indeed on many issues and on many big global issues also. There is need for deepening cooperation. So I would like to turn to Ottilia, who already started actually to encouraging us to think in a constructive way and to reflect on the basis of all what we have been discussing and on the chain effects, let's say, of from one crisis to many dimensions of policy that is actually relevant for both African countries, African Union, and the European Union, and to look ahead, let's say, in terms of a rethink, if possible, perhaps substantial rethink. And the question will be somehow the same. Migration and mobility and displacement is part of the picture, but it's very much connected to many other issues, as actually this crisis also is showing to us. And so, yes, for moving towards a more constructive and deeper engagement, let's say, and meaningful engagement that actually is able to address all these newly created difficulties or exacerbated difficulties and challenges that are impacting the daily lives of many people in Africa. What are the ways forward, let's say, not only on migration and mobility, but in the broader framework? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asli. And again, Professor Lalu makes my job so much easier. As you know, as Professor Lalu was speaking, I had a thought in my mind, which is, why are we having
that means we are so close from South Africa to North Africa.
Exactly. Exactly. But the thought was, why are we having this conversation at all? And the reality is, it's because it's unavoidable. What are the two things that we can't get away from? We can't get away from the fact that Africa and Europe are neighbors. Much like in your homes and wherever you are, that's an unavoidable fact, no matter how much you try to ignore it. The second is, we can't get away from the fact that we are all interconnected, and what we do is interrelated. Whether it is from the trade perspective, where Africa's raw materials are quite key and integral, not only for African industries, but industries globally. Whether it is the human resource capacity that comes with it. Professor Lalu spoke about, for example, changing the ways in which particular markets develop their policies on labor migration, whether it's on the farms or in the factories or in the offices. The reality is, this conversation is unavoidable. So what's important is, how do we make it such that in 10 years' time, we're not having the same conversation? What are what I like to call our roadblocks, so to speak? And I think the first and main one is not sitting at a table and speaking at the same level and as peers. The relationship between Africa and Europe is, for the most part, a vertical relationship, in that perception or otherwise, that Africa finds itself either being regarded internationally or otherwise as below Europe, both from a financial point of view, but also even on an international relations platform. that means that even the negotiations, whether it's post-Cotonou or whether it's for the joint Africa-EU strategy or any other relationship, that often it becomes bogged down in perception, it becomes bogged down in who pays, and therefore it is presumed that because Europe covers part of the cost, that in fact this becomes a Europe-led policy. It's also sometimes devoid of consultation and respect. I will say, when the new Pact for Migration and Asylum was launched in September, my first thought was, how many Africans, I knew that I wasn't one of those Africans that was consulted, but how many other Africans were consulted in essentially a pact that relates to Africa? And can we really call it a pact if one party, a key element to that agreement, is missing? I understand and appreciate that it is a pact between European countries, but where it relates essentially to other regions, not just Africa, but also Asia and the Americas, it is important to understand what could then affect its ability to be operationalized in the field. So if, for example, and we're speaking here from an Africa-EU perspective, but if, for example, the African continent or members of the African continent feel that certain language, it may not even be a substantive or principal issue, but certain language used in reference to the circumstances in Africa is simply inaccurate, it creates a block. If it is seen that African trade is only viewed from an external extractive point of view, rather than how important it would be for Africa to meet its developmental imperatives such that it can be a better and stronger trading partner. Imagine this at the beginning of 2020, if the fight between China and the US wasn't between those two, but actually a conversation of engagement around how best these two global powers can actually partner with their other neighbors, Europe, the Middle East, as well as Africa. But that wasn't the case, and it isn't right now. And I think it's almost me pleading to take it back to the basics of what a partnership is. A partnership is not one-sided. A relationship is not one-sided. It may take years to meet, to see eye to eye. It may take years to agree. But if the partnership must work, agreement has to be reached. It's not enough to dismiss certain arguments simply because they do not seem logical when you're not stopping to really interrogate. And I'm not saying this only from a critical lens for the European Union. The same applies also for the African Union. When it comes to negotiating agreements and pacts and partnerships, it's also important that you also bring your best people into the room. And it's important that even if the discussion, and I'm going to wrap up and end on this point, but even if the discussion is on migration, what 2020 and the COVID-19 crisis has taught us is nothing exists in isolation. You can be dealing with migration issues, but ultimately you're also dealing, and I'll repeat some of these points, you're dealing with issues of governance, you're dealing with issues of trade, you're dealing with issues of security, and you're dealing with issues of labor and free will. So if you are negotiating on a particular point of migration, it might actually help to have people in the room that are not migration experts, that are people that focus on the other issues as well that are interrelated. Because sometimes even we who care passionately about a particular issue can end up with tunnel vision. And the reality is the world does not exist in a tunnel. The world relies on these key elements to work together. So in ending, what are some of the things that we listed in our forthcoming paper on areas that Europe and Africa can be able to partner better on issues of migration and mobility? First, we looked at relooking securitization of migration. and finding ways to improve governance of migration over essentially the criminalization of movement. And I'll repeat this point, because people will move, people will migrate, whether in country or out of country, they will. The question we need to ask ourselves is, do we want them to move illegally or legally? Which brings me to the second area that we looked at, which are issues of legal labor migration pathways. Let's interrogate what the needs are on both sides in upskilling, but also in terms of the gaps in resources. I spoke about the age of Africa being a young continent, which means, like it or not, that a lot of labor for the future in Africa and out of Africa is going to come from the continent. You simply cannot compare it with countries where the median age sits above 40, where you need those critical resources, but importantly, people that can learn and that can learn quickly. So that's an area that can be improved and where conversation can be a two-way street. The third that we looked at was migration and economic development, which is something that is key for the African continent, but ways through which both parties can be able to leverage it. The fourth are issues of remittances, which is connected to this. For some countries, Somalia, for example, without remittances, there would be very limited income. How do you ensure better ways of access for remittances, easier digital platforms, easier ways to be able to do this, but importantly, to ensure that it is regulated within the formal system, not the informal. The fifth that we looked at were ways to enhance international protection and the observance of migrant rights as well. And this is an area where Africa can be able to teach Europe. Having to deal with refugee crisis from immediate neighbors, Africa has found ways to be able to ensure that the refugee crises don't become local problems as they are problems of neighboring countries. The final point that we covered are issues of return, readmission, and reintegration that are done in proper ways. To repeat something that Professor Adepoju said, the majority of Africans move within the African continent and they move close by. It means if you're able to handle those issues properly, the number of people that are sent back from further afield will likely reduce. So in order to improve Europe's migration response, you do need to improve Africa's first. I'll end there, Asli. Sorry for taking a little bit longer than I thought.
No problem at all. I'm sure everybody, like I did, enjoyed your contribution very much. And thank you so much, Otilia, again, for wrapping up and bringing all the important issues and not only substantial issues, but also issues related to language, to narratives and framing of and perceptions and behavior, let's say, which are certainly very important. So as we don't have that much time, let me see if there's a question. Yes, there's a question from Silvia Ferrero, who is asking, are there working experiences of collaborations between schools with humanitarian channels open between African and European countries to train students and enable them to develop businesses in Africa in collaboration with European companies? If so, in which countries? And she adds, can web economy help a more equal contribution? Very to the point, particular question. Perhaps if any other participant has, I don't see any raised hands, but if there's a question, we can perhaps collect in addition to Sylvia's question. So please raise your hand via the chat function, via the raise hand function, or just turn on your camera and ask your question. That we can also do that. Luca Barana has a question for Professor Lalu. What are the measures aimed to facilitate the socioeconomic impact of remittances that could be included in a future EU-Africa partnership? the measures aim to facilitate the socioeconomic impact of remittances. Actually, that is, yes, an interesting issue that Ottilia very briefly touched on, and it's actually in terms of the facilitating access and transfer and lowering the costs, etc., that has been talked about a lot. And actually, you were mentioning, Ottilia, the digital methods, let's say, to improving that, and which made me think about the nothing in isolation, and all these issues are connected to each other, and made me think of the one of the pillars of the priorities, let's say, of the partnership agenda is also digitalization. And actually here we already see, for instance, a link. And let's see, we have another question from Luca. So one question about the education. I think Ottilia and they already replied to Sylvia, but perhaps we can touch upon that, the issue of training and in cooperation with European companies to help businesses in Africa. And whoops. So remittances, what are the measures, Professor Lalu, for you to benefit better from the remittances? And to Ottilia, do you think that migration conditionality will play an increasing role in future European policies? And if so, linked to what you mentioned about a vertical relation, how could the African Union mitigate this policy discourse? Conditionality and a vertical or ideally horizontal relationship. And we have another question of Valeria Farjon. Instead of dispersing EU development funds in so many directions, would the speakers consider it useful to focus more of EU's overseas development aid on supporting African health systems? Focusing the development aid on focusing.
What is the end of your question, Asli, please?
Sorry?
Focusing on the end of what? This last questions.
Channeling the official development aid of the EU instead of dispersing it on many areas, would it be useful to focus it on health systems in Africa? And a final question, and I don't think we can take more questions at this point, from Utba Mahmoud. Are there any grand initiatives to better connect the African Union, European Union, like the Belt and Road Initiative? How successful will this take place? What about other initiatives like possible African Union, EU, and ASEAN connectivity and social mobility? So maybe we start with Mehdi on the issue of remittances, development aid and health systems, and then maybe the broader issue of something similar between the African Union and European Union, similar to the Belt and Road Initiative, and perhaps making a multi-regional, let's say, consortium, not consortium, but a cooperation between African Union, EU, ASEAN, between the regional bodies, let's say.
I don't know if we do have enough time to develop all these the responses for all these questions, as we have.
You can pick the one of the questions.
As we do have to stop at 11:30, that it isn't it? According to the first question from Luca regarding to remittances, I think that during the year 2020 there will be a decrease of about 25%. And already by, I think, by the end of July or the beginning of August, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, produced an estimation of a decrease of about 23% of the remittances from outside of Africa to African countries. Now, on this point, there is two kind of solution. The first one is that the European countries, the European public authorities has to do everything to make this transfer easier and less expensive. They are difficult and they are very, very expensive. And that the European bank, the American banks are getting about 15–20% of such remittances, such transfers, and it's a very, very, it's not sustainable for the migrant, even for the migrant. And the second is according to to the internal economic policy of the African countries. Here I will speak about Moroccan authorities. They do have to facilitate investment. They do have to give more guarantee to the migrant to open companies and to build activities here in their countries. And for me, they need more warranty, more protection, and this protection are not here. And it's why many Moroccans migrants in Europe today are willing to invest their money in European countries and not in their own country. And this is very problematic. We need in our countries less corruption. We need the reform of the justice system, and like that, not only we will receive more remittances from the migrant in the other part of the world, but we will also receive more direct investment. So this is a problem of the internal economic policy. And I tell another response according to this point. The problem is not only the use of remittances, but is the use of the social capital linked to the migrant outside of our country. And we do have to mobilize our high-skilled people who are living today outside of Africa, outside of Morocco, and I speak here within my Moroccan experience. We do have to lead a policy to push Moroccan in abroad to help to the development of the internal economy, to give more support to the many programs in health system, in educational system, in industry, and so on. When I spoke about this Moroccan migrant in the United States, Monsif Slawi, who is leading this operation of speed warp, we do have thousands of Moroccan like Slawi. We do have many Moroccans working with Korean companies, Japanese companies, French companies, French public institution of research, and we do have to benefit of still somehow from the capacities and the know-how of these people. And this is very important. It's more important for me than the remittances. Now, according to the European aid, the aid it's only for the sanitary system, for the health system. And I told you before a moment that who are helping Europe are the African doctors. The African doctors who today are helping Europe and helping also America, helping also Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Israel even. And the fact is we do have to receive a compensation for that. The African countries, the poorest one. And here I speak about, for example, Djibouti, for Namibia, for example, Cameroon, Niger, where the system, the health system is very low. We do have to pay for these countries some compensation to help to rebuild the sanitation, to the health system. But no, we don't need only African countries are not only on need for the health system, but also for the school system, the new technology system, and also for the economic, all the economic sectors to give the Africa the opportunity to be to some extent a little bit independent from China, and also independent from the importation of vital products and vital and alimentation.
Thank you very much, Lalu. And I turn to Ottilia quickly. We have about 2-3 minutes, let's say, until close.
I'm sorry, Ottilia.
No, nothing at all. So Ottilia, maybe you can pick, as I said, or link some of the questions if possible. And there's a final question about energy and fuel exporting countries of Africa, such as Algeria. How should the EU's attitude change to that? I thank for the question, but I think we have already covered quite a broad ground, and maybe the energy issue would be dealt with later on in another occasion. So Otilia, the floor is yours, and after that we will say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Asli. I pretty much only have a minute to respond to so many questions, but I'll try. And I'll go through them in turn. To Sylvia, I did already write a message in response to your question, which is that within the scope of the paper, we covered some initiatives. What I would like to stress here, and this is obviously an advert, read our paper, please. We put a lot of work into it, but no, beyond that, it doesn't explore the full scope of various cooperation at a bilateral level. So while we focus here more on the bilateral between Africa as a continent and the EU as a continent, there's a lot of initiatives at country level that help to build and to upskill people that aren't necessarily geared towards migration. And I think I want to stress this point, which is while some initiatives like Global Skill Partnership and so forth are aimed towards upskilling people that will migrate, that the majority of initiatives are actually aimed at developing skills locally. And there are lots of examples at bilateral country level, but also specific companies that have their business interests primarily in Africa that do ways of collaborating. On the issue of conditionality, Luca, this is a very important point, and it's a pity I have no time to thoroughly respond here. But again, this is an issue that I think ought to be best negotiated before it is imposed. And I want to repeat this, negotiated before imposition, because imposition lacks consultation. And often that is where there are disagreements. And on the African side, methods to mitigate have already happened, not only in respect of migration, but generally in terms of who they partner with. And this responds to the question that Utba posed around, they posed it in respect of the Belt and Road Initiative, but who is Africa partnering with where Europe's conditions can't be met as easily as they would hope? Africa is partnering with Russia, with Turkey, with China, with partners towards the east of the continent rather than towards the north. Partners that are not necessarily our neighbors and that may not have our best interests in mind, but that is what happens. You displace partnerships instead of strengthening those partnerships. And then perhaps the last one, and I will go into that a little bit, Asli, and then end, is the question that Reinhold posed around the energy transition and issues of fossil fuel. I know this is specific to Algeria, but I think generally one of the challenges that we've encountered on the African continent is being the ones directly impacted by the use of fossil fuels while not being the primary generators and while still lagging behind in terms of our development imperative. There is so much in terms of potential partnerships that can be cultivated at a bilateral and multilateral level here. Lessons that we can learn from countries that are now using more energy efficient ways to electrify their zones. Denmark is a good example of using renewable energy sources and hoping to shift away from fossil fuels. And then, sorry, Asli, very, very final point, which relates to the issue of ODA. I do hear the point of departure there, but again, and I want to re-stress this, the issues are not singular. And if all money is invested into one pot, so to speak, it's not actually going to have the right kind of impact that it has. You need only look at the impact or lack thereof of the EU Trust Fund so far as it relates to migration. Would it have been better placed if it focused on development generally and looking at ways to ensure improving of livelihoods over ending migration? I'll end there. Sorry, I took 2.5 minutes.
No, please, no need to sorry at all. We could have gone for longer. I'm sure everybody is like me, willing to listen even more. And thank you so much for all these contributions, Otilia and Mehdi. And I'm sorry for the technical difficulties we had with Professor Adepoju. Thank you so much to everybody, to our speakers first and foremost, and to the participants of this discussion. And as Otilia said, stay tuned, please, for the papers that are coming out. Once in a while we will publish and promote them anyways, as we are very proud of this mini project that we have. And we hope to meet you all in the future in other discussions. And thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon.